Story points. What a mystical concept. Well, let's deep dive into what they're about and how to use them to do agile estimations, how to teach them to your team, and how to get started with estimations. We're going to cover a couple of things like creating a baseline, just simulating an activity to help them understand the concept, also practicing how to create a baseline. What is planning poker? What are some questions that you should anticipate and some answers that you can give as well? If you like this topic, please hit the like button so it helps with the YouTube algorithm. And remember to subscribe so that you get notified about new videos on the channel. What I'm going to be covering is some science behind the value of estimating as a team versus individuals. And we're going to get a crash course on how to start teaching the concept to your teams. And there's some little tad bits and twists and turns that I'm going to be adding in here that you can choose to use. I would like to reinforce that story points or agile estimations are something that take time and experience to master. And it takes much longer than the length of this video, for example, to really understand and to be able to apply and own. So I'm going to be setting some foundation. I'm going to equip you with a couple of tips and tricks and some facilitation ideas to help with nailing down how to teach estimations to your team. So the way I set up this session for a group of Scrum Masters and Kanban leads that I was training recently was that we jumped right into the activity. And one of the first things to do here is to not tell them anything and just set up the session to say, we're going to talk about story points and estimation, but let's just get started with this activity. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take you through what I did. And of course, bring in your own twists and turns to help nail the concepts down for your team much better. So the way I started was just using simple geometric shapes. And I said, which of these is the least complex to draw by hand? And, we opened up for discussion. We talked about, well, square might be simpler, triangle, maybe it's only 3 sides, less sides than a square. Circle is the most difficult to draw by hand, perhaps. So they started to have a conversation. And all of a sudden, the team asked, well, what tools do we have to draw with? And so I outlined, and you can do anything here to make it easier, more difficult, or change the conversation. As I said, well, you have a piece of paper, simple white sheet of paper, nothing special, and a pencil to draw with. And then I said, any other tools? I said, well, you have a ruler and you have a right angle measure. And so they said, okay, well, we have a right angle measure, we have a ruler, so we know we could do straight lines, we could do right angles really well. And the one shape that has both of those that will work really well is a square. So I said, so then with what I'd like you to do is then come to a decision as a team, as a group here, that square is the simplest. And so some folks were still, well, okay, are we sure we make a triangle? It could be easier, etc. And it turns out that the larger group then agreed upon that based on the tools available and the requirement, the square was the least complex to draw by hand. And so all I did here was that I just dragged a 2 and I said, you guys don't know what this means. It means nothing right now, but I'm just going to put a 2 here just for fun. And the next question I asked them is, well, which is the next least complex to draw by hand? And then now that we have a 2 here, so I'm just gonna copy and paste a little 2 here just to have that in their memory as they have this next conversation. Well, if it's by hand, we have a ruler, we have a right angle ruler as well. Then what is the next least complex to draw by hand? And they said, well, that sounds like the triangle. Okay, so I said, all right, so what I'll do is I'll put a little 5 next to the triangle. Again, this 5 or 2 don't mean anything to you. I'm just going to do that. All right, so what happens now is that we now have a 2 and a 5 here. And I said, well, what about a circle now? And I told them, well, use the scale at the bottom here. use the scale of these series of numbers to say, okay, now compared to the square and the triangle, how much more or less complex is it to draw a circle by hand with the tools that we have? And they said, well, that's a lot. It's going to be a lot. I said, okay, pick a number. Is it, 10 times more complex than a square, or 20 times or 30 times more complex than a triangle? Any sense of that? They said, well, the highest number on the scale is 100. So I'm just going to give it, we should just going to give it a 100 if we have to compare. So now what you've done as a facilitator is you've created something like a scale. You've created a scale of complexity that tells us that compared to a square, a triangle is about 2.5 times more difficult based on the tools we have, and a circle is definitely, based on a square, 50 times much more complex to draw by hand with the tools we have, and 20 times more than a triangle. Okay, well, I said, and this is a good tip, you could start with something more complex or controversial, or less complex or controversial, is up to you. The next shape, I said, all right, so I said, now what I'd like you to do is, with these numbers at the bottom, what I'd like you to do is raise with your hand. So we did this over a virtual Zoom call by hand. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20 was just this or this, however it shows, or 40 was this, or 60 was this, and then 100 was just like, which is a sense of, okay, it's too big, it's too complex. All right. So you did by hand. You could do this by paper. You can, people have cards, they can create little cards. You can make it a good, fun activity to start off. However you want to do it is up to you, but these are some good tools. This is a good, simple technique for you to just get started with a group. So I said, okay, now what I'd like you to do is I'm going to throw up a shape here, and I'd like you to raise, compared to a square or a triangle or a circle, how much more, less, or more complex. So I went with, just start with square and triangle. That's a simple way to get this conversation going. And so the shape I threw up was this one. And they started to have a conversation about, well, that's just a circle, that's just a square, turned in 45 degrees. And how much more or less complex could it be? I said, well, can we turn the paper? And I said, no, you just have to draw that as is. And they said, okay, that's a little more complex. So and the team somehow just could not come to an agreement when I asked them to go 3, 2, 1, raise up your score in terms of complexity on what you think is the complexity of this shape. And so they couldn't, for whatever reason, there was a huge variance between this specific group. In some groups, the conversation might be very simple. In some, it'll be much more complex. And so that's okay. You let that happen. It's the group's way of processing that information, or the team's way to do that. So they couldn't, for whatever reason, they couldn't come to an agreement. So I said, okay, you know what? Let's park this to the side. Let's look at another shape, and let's determine how much more or less complex this is for you to draw by hand. And when they saw the line, they said, oh, that's definitely simpler than a square. So I said, okay, great. If that's the conversation, in 3, 2, 1, what is your number, or your score for where this should be on the scale that you've just created? And they said, oh, that's definitely a 1. It's definitely less complex than a square. And so I said, okay, great, that has a 1. Let's go to another shape, an octagon. It has 8 sides. And they said, okay, well, I said, now let's have a quick discussion. So where does this fall? Well, somewhere between a triangle and a circle is where the discussion went. And then I said, okay, it seems most of you are agreeing on this. Where in 3, 2, 1, where does it fit on the scale? And so they said, this is definitely much more complex. They gave this one a 40. That was a sense of size to say, oh, it's about somewhere in between a triangle and a circle, but it has clear straight lines that can turn into sides, and it still may be easier, more towards the triangle than a circle to draw. I said, okay, what about the star? And in their opinion, when they scored again, so you go again, 3, 2, 1, raise their score. All of them went like this. They said compared to an octagon and a triangle, this is somewhere really up there. This is at least 2 to 2.5 times more complex than an octagon. And so that's a little conversation. Now, some of you may have caught this. That's a little conversation starter right here for you as someone teaching your team how to use story points. Say, okay, so based on the score you have given, this means that to draw by hand a star and a circle are about the same effort and complexity, and that turned the conversation a little bit. They said, well, no, it's still not as difficult as a circle, and it is somewhere in between the octagon and the circle, but it's not as difficult as a circle. We can still draw the straight lines with a ruler. We still have the right tools for it. And so then they changed their estimate unanimously. So I called that again. So 3, 2, 1, and then they put up their score. They changed this score to a 60 to say, well, it's somewhere in between here, so we're going to give it a 60. It doesn't matter. This is not a unit of any kind of time or anything. It's purely complexity in being able to draw this figure. So after they've had that conversation, now I said, well, now you have this rhombus right here that we had deferred for the time being. At the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, go ahead and score where you think it fits in the scale. And so for the most part, at first, the team said, well, definitely between a triangle and an octagon. But then the way to refine this for you as someone facilitating the training is to ask how much more or less. Do you think it's about 4 times? Is it double? Just about triple? Is it about 8 times? Like how much more complex do you think it is from the triangle, or how much less from the octagon? This is a tip. You can choose to throw another wrench in this and say, well, all of a sudden, I find out from somewhere, I as a product owner, that in the company, we have a stamp that draws that octagon perfectly for us. And all we need to do is just stamp it onto the piece of paper. And that's the request. I found a stamp. How does that change your estimate in terms of complexity or effort to now draw this octagon? And everyone now rated it a 1 to say this is now easy, just as easy as drawing a line. Some even argued easier than. We said, okay, well, it's the smallest unit, so let's use that on the scale. And so this is a good way to give them a little touch of reality to say there's new information that can come in that will change your estimate. And then it allows them to also look at this as, oh, I would have given this, still 20, 40, 30 hours to draw versus now it's as simple as a line. And so it takes away some of that confusion that may start to occur around effort being just measured in time versus effort being compared to other units. With this group, I established that there are really 3 big major building blocks for story points. The first is a definition of done. A definition of done is the list in their mind that is clear for everyone, and if you don't have one already, you need to put one in place. And then if you have one already, consider revising it or having a renewed conversation about definition of done, especially if you're now introducing story points to your team as the unit of measure. Second, conversation. So going back to that exercise, one of the ways I connected the exercise to the content is going back to the exercise. Do you think you would have estimated, or you were able to come to these decisions on complexity and effort of all of these items if you hadn't talked to each other about it, or if you hadn't asked me questions around what constraints and what tools you have in place? So this really gives them a taste of, yes, we need to have a conversation about who, what, where, when, why, and then some even about how when we're giving an estimate on any given piece of work we're doing. The last building block that I covered with this team is relative estimation. The third building block, which is very important. So we could also use the word comparative here if that's what resonates for you naturally more, or for the team, for them to really wrap their head around this. There's there is research which I will share in the description below that supports that couple of things. Number one, we are better at estimating as human beings with by comparing to something that exists versus in an abstract absolute form. We're better at doing that. So if I were to give you a headphone, say this one, and give you another head and then just ask you how good is this headphone, you would say, yeah, it's all right, it's good. Like, you're not really sure. But if I gave you two headphones or three or 10, over comparing them, you would be able to say, you know what, I rank this headphone number one, the other number two, number three, number four, etc. And so we're, as human beings, are better at comparing things than we are, especially our own experience, than we are at just in absolution saying that something is a certain unit of measure or difficulty, etc. So the importance of having this scale, and your team can easily default into starting to think about story points as hours or days, and they try to convert and create all kinds of mathematical calculations to say, you know, half a story point is 1 day. And then they use that scale to then just say what they wanted to say in the first place. Please, please, please defer your teams from doing that. Bring them back to talking about complexity and effort, how much more or less, and comparing to previous experience that they as a team have done some work on, or something that they've established as a baseline, like we did earlier. The three shapes we used earlier was now to establish a baseline to say, all right, square is the simplest in the three images in front of us. Triangle is the next more complex, and then circle is the most complex. And we established that as a great scale, usually creating 2 to 3 kind of baseline units are really, really useful. And you could do this with your backlog. You could take 3-4 items of varying complexity and size and say, what are the, let's assign these some basic points, and then start to compare and create relative estimates based on those for every item we talk about. Now you've experienced, or you've taken the team towards an experience of how to create a baseline, how to have a conversation about the work items, and then also how to estimate. The next is this for you is, how do we actually do this? So the simulation I went through just now is planning poker, and a lot of you probably recognize that. And so then you want to cover with your team, well, what are what is it that we're doing? And you can start to peel the onion or uncover a few details for them to go through. So planning poker is one of the most common ways to use story points in estimating and with agile teams. And it's actually just a few simple steps. The first thing we do is facilitated by a team facilitator. So a Scrum Master. In this company, they call them Agile Delivery Managers. Kanban leads, I just call them team facilitators as a common term across various different practices. It's good to cover who will estimate, who it puts up a point, who estimates any given piece of work. Well, it's estimated by everybody creating the product. And there's further research, again, covered in the description below, that proves that if all the people doing the work are the best people to inform the estimate on how much work it will take. And so we cannot be doing that if we're not the ones that are building. And if you're someone that is doing the work of building software or building a product, then you're the one that needs to be part of the estimate. So in a common, let's say, software team, this would mean a back-end developer, front-end developer perhaps, tester, analyst, if they're a configurator, network engineer, security engineer, etc., people that have fingers to keys to actually build a product, and they're responsible for creating the product. Additional people that attend a planning poker session or any estimation conversation is a product owner, of course, or a SME, a subject matter expert that is knowledgeable about the business context and the customer's voice, etc. If you can have the customer in the room, that is absolutely great. But a common way to look at this is anybody requesting the work and that can explain what is required is good to have in that conversation before you're estimating. And so estimation is simple. Planning poker is simple, and you go through the 5 steps of planning poker. I took these visuals from Mountain Goat Software. This is Mike Cohen, who has been a very experienced agilist from even before the manifesto, who creates these simple step-by-step guides as well as visuals for you to show your team. So feel free to take them. Link is in the description below as well. You go through the steps. Well, we're all are going to have a card, and this is going to be the scale. We use a modified Fibonacci series for simplicity. If they do ask you why Fibonacci series, well, you can explain that the Fibonacci series is fairly well spaced out. And so as we know about the Fibonacci series, that every number is the sum of the previous 2 numbers before it. And so the series is spaced out enough to be able to get a sense of 2.5 or 10 times or 5 times bigger, etc., or more complex. And so that's why we use Fibonacci series. But this is a good explanation. There's other more detailed explanations that exist for Fibonacci series. I'm happy to provide them in the step 1. Each estimator has a set of cards, those questions and those answers. 2, 1, boop. At the same time, a couple of different things can happen. The first is everyone gives it the same value. Great. Well, that's the estimate. Easy. Then it's, well, what if there's a fairly good variance across all the teams? There could be someone giving a really high estimate compared to the rest of the team, someone giving a really low estimate compared to the rest of the team. Well, you have a simple tool in your hands to solve that problem. You ask them. What is it that feels more complex for you? And they may reveal more information that they may have, or they may really reveal that I am uncertain and I'm not sure of the volume of work here, or the risk or uncertainty, or in general the complexity that we need to deal with. You ask the one giving the lower estimate the same question. What are you thinking? What are questions in your mind? Or what knowledge can you share with the team about this item? And so they may share, well, either oh no, we already have this solution in place, we just have to make small changes. And so in my opinion, testing this or building this is actually very easy. Or they may say, well, maybe I'm not sure about what is actually required. Can you tell me more? And that is a way to find out, what kind of misunderstandings or gaps in information, or what kind of information exists in the team that is not out in the discussion yet. And so you start to see how important discussion is to this conversation and to this activity of estimating. Well, then you estimate. So then you go 3, 2, 1. All right, guys, after you've clarified some information across each other or asked the product owner or SMEs, 3, 2, 1, pull up your estimate, and then you can rinse and repeat. The goal is to get to consensus. Sometimes you will have an outlier, and the team may agree to say, well, you know what? All of us give this item an 8, and we think it's about 4 times as much as this other item that was a 2. And someone still feels that this is let's say a 20 or something like that. Sometimes it may warrant a discussion, and sometimes it is just they're being risk averse, or they just feel like it's not something that is correctly representing the effort. Well, in that case, the team, I've also seen that the team can actually choose to say, well, just trust us on this one. Let's use this estimate of 8 for now. And if it turns out to be much more than we all thought, then we can use this as a relative point to estimate the next set of items. And that'll help us kind of, balance our risk out in the future as well. Well, sometimes what can also happen is the team really can't decide. So you really are seeing that every single person has a completely different view of this one item. That can happen. Or the team may also decide that, we don't know enough to estimate this item yet. Let's go out and get more information. And getting more information can happen in a couple of different ways. The first is, well, let's go back to the client or the requester and understand from them or clarify from them these set of questions we have. The other way of looking at this is to sometimes as a team, you need to go and investigate in your systems or in your product capability to understand if something is doable or what are the risks. And, this may be part of an area you haven't touched before as a team. So what is it that's causing this risk to go up, or this information that needs to be further clarified? So that's a little bit about how to introduce planning poker and some techniques you could be using and agreeing upon as a team to handle, a lack of consensus when it's really varied. Or this is just tips for you as a facilitator to just keep in your back pocket and use as you're facilitating. And then in my case, and this is very useful for you, feel free to screenshot this and add more of your questions or comments. There's some rules we outlined for this set of people that we were training. Is number one, don't equate to hours. And I've mentioned that earlier. Don't take estimates separately from each team member. You're always doing them as a group, and everybody doing the work must be represented present in that group. Avoid estimation inception. Now, this is a term I think I coined, but I don't know, but this is my disclaimer. I may or may not have coined this term. But estimation inception refers to the idea that we need to estimate the effort or work it takes to analyze perhaps something to get it ready for an estimate. So hence the word inception. We don't estimate the work that doesn't provide value or a solution into the client's hands. We only estimate the work that does. And so we avoid estimation inception. This is not about tracking every single hour, every single activity that is being done in the team. This is about how much more or less complex do we think a certain piece of work is, so we can get a sense of what we're committing to. Rule, always discuss first. Discussion is key. If I haven't said that enough, then go back and watch this video again and you will see how many times I've said discuss. Don't estimate bugs, fix them. Simple, truthful. If you want to hold yourself as a team, as a product to a higher standard of quality, then don't ignore the bugs that are coming out of the system. Fix them, because they will create less bugs going forward in production, perhaps, and which means you will have less bugs that are not part of what you're building coming into the system. So any bugs generated, you don't ignore them, you fix them right away. And that's why we don't estimate bugs, because they don't provide value. Something's wrong and you need to fix it. These are estimations, not calculations. Well, these are estimations, not calculations. So this is, again, the sense for the team to understand how much less or more work something might be, but it's not a promise. And it's not a calculation of, okay, this is going to take us 20 hours. So I'm just going to say, 40 points because I said it's half a point is 1 hour or something like that. And so it is not a calculation. It is an estimate, a sense of complexity and effort that might be required to do something. All right. And there are other questions here that I've parked that you can feel free to use and get prepared with more information. I'll have more links in the description so you can look at some great sources of information, but also think about what questions you may have, you may anticipate your team may ask you. And lastly, I'm going to wrap this up by saying, teach your team the concept, understand it yourself about the why. Establish a baseline like the geometric activity I did. There are a couple other ways you could do this. I prefer the shapes. They're simple. They're, at some point, every one of us has drawn a square, a triangle, and a circle in one way, shape, or form or another. And we've done it with different tools, maybe sometimes with a compass, sometimes without a compass in the case of a circle. So you get a sense of the limitations or ease that you may have, right? Discuss one unestimated item at a time. There is a way to do bulk estimations. I won't cover that in this video. I'm going to create another video to really talk about larger high-level estimates. So, stay tuned for that. Like and subscribe for that, and I'd be happy to create it. The next thing is remember to estimate relatively only. Compare it to the work you've done in the past, not in isolation or absolution. Compare it to experience the team has had doing some work that you want to estimate against. Next, execute the sprint and measure velocity. So now shifting from hours to story points, you're going to measure velocity in story points. How many story points did we cover in our sprint? And that will give you a sense of how much to commit to every sprint, but also it'll give you a sense of, where is it that we can start to see our stable team performance starting to happen? And how many story points do we, are we full capacity and we're able to manage it and complete it, 80 to 90% of the time. And so continue doing that. After that, just repeat steps 3 and 4. Now check out these videos for more Agile related content.
Hey, thanks for watching. Today we're going to talk about bulk estimates. Bulk estimates are required, or scaling your estimation is required when you need a large amount of work to be estimated quickly. That could be in a couple of things. Number one, it could be in the form of your backlog that just you haven't seen in a long time and you want to quickly just get a sense of how much of work is left in your backlog. Or you have a request that requires quick, immediate response that you need to estimate for sizing, for timing, etc. So I'm going to be covering a couple of those techniques and a couple of cautions as well. And then the big question near the end of the video is going to be, well, how do I then say when something is going to be done? Perhaps. If you like this topic and are interested in more videos like this, please hit the like button and hit the subscribe button as well. It helps promote the channel, helps others use these techniques, and helps me learn what others are interested about. So please take a moment to do that. As some of you may have seen on another one of my videos around just introducing story points as estimates. Let's say you're a team that has these building blocks in place and you use planning poker to do estimations. Bulk estimation is not very different. But let's just make sure that we have a common ground. The first thing is you use planning poker to do relative estimates in all of your backlog. The second is that you've been doing this for a little while, a couple of sprints even is fine, and your team is used to using relative estimations as a way of measuring. This is a key building block. And in another video you'll see down in the description, I've covered how to get started with planning poker and how to get started with story points, but this assumes that you do that. Now, a lot of you have your backlog may look something like this. This is what a good backlog looks like. If you're in a current iteration and you have a set of items that are in your backlog that are at the top of your iteration, at the top of your backlog. So you're working on these, they're broken down into small sizes and chunks. You can use any of these stories to actually start working on something. So you're working on this currently, and these are high priority items as you can see on the scale on the right. Well, then you have other items that are actually slightly longer outlook than just an iteration. So this could be for a release, this could be just in the next few iterations, or relatively lower on the priority list. And these things are things you may have estimated, may not have estimated, but in the large sense, you know what they're about, and you've actually estimated a higher amount of these as well. And then you have things that are just there in your backlog for a lower priority for another day, or they're deferred for many reasons. They're not required by the customer until a much later time, or these are things that you just don't know much about, but we know that we want to do something about these in the future. So your backlog is divided into these. That may be future releases. Bulk estimations really help if we need to figure out how to estimate a large number of backlog items all at once. So going back, it's to think about this level, anything between the release and the future. And it could be a subset of items within this future, or it could be all of them. That depends on your backlog and your situation, on what type of work you do. But that's something, that's what bulk estimations are really effective with, when your backlog looks something like this, if it were represented on a wall somewhere. So there are two scenarios here. What if we need to estimate features or large number of backlog items? The first scenario is you want to estimate a big chunk of your backlog, just so you know how much work there is left in your backlog. The second is you have a new request to estimate and respond to some sort of a requester, a customer need, or a feature idea that your team may have had that will really help the customer really with simplifying a process or something like that. All right. So there are two common ways to do bulk estimations with Agile backlogs. The first one is t-shirt sizing, and the other one is affinity mapping. T-shirt sizing, as the name suggests, is using our t-shirt size, small, medium, large, extra large, extra small, etc. And affinity mapping, if you just look at the definition of the word affinity, it means like items or things that are related in some sort of way that you cluster together. So we're going to be exploring both of those. Let's start with affinity mapping. So affinity mapping is an effective tool when we have a large number of ideas and a lot of data to work with. It helps us solve a complex problem. So sometimes it's about getting into the feature or the request, and you need to really understand what it is. So it helps you break down and cluster things. It's also very useful in a non-estimation context, but in general for brainstorming. And this is an idea that comes from a lot of UX UI design world, where they generate a lot of ideas and they start to make sense of it, especially when it comes to customer journeys and user experience design. Affinity mapping can also help you think outside the box. And this is when you want to throw up a bunch of ideas. That's the goal. And then you start to make sense of them afterwards. So we'll get into that in just a second. There are a few benefits of affinity mapping. One, it reduces groupthink. So this concept that, if two people think that this is a certain amount of size, or two people think a certain way, I'm just going to say yes, because I don't want to be singled out as the not in agreement one. Team alignment and sync. So the funny thing is that it actually sparks good conversation, good discussion to bring common understanding and synchronization within the team's thinking on what's expected here. The last is release and midterm planning. So this is really good for a slightly longer term horizon than your iteration, but not too far out. But it can be very good for something like a 6-month planning or 1-year planning, which if you're an agile team, you shouldn't really be doing that long phase of planning, but it can help with non-software teams with at least clustering and making sense of their ideas. So for silent sizing, what you're going to do is ask your team members to quietly look at the set of backlogs. So you would pick, let's say, the first feature or first set of related things to begin with. And you're going to say, all right, quietly in your own spaces, and you could do this virtually as well, order from the smallest to largest, order all these stories that you have within any given feature or any given work, broken down a little bit, and order them into smallest and largest. And people will just throw up what they think is the right thing to, right kind of sense of size across multiple stories within a feature. And what you're going to do then is that will be the around that all of you discuss together in this space, where you say, okay, why is story number 4 that much smaller than story number 9? Or I think story number 1 is actually really small because here's the information I have that can help with this. And that's why I rated it as smallest. So it creates a good discussion. It also, as someone facilitating this session, you're seeing what are common patterns, or at least things that the team is very clear about. For example, if majority of the people, if not all of them, put story number 8 at largest, it gives you a trend view that, okay, everyone believes this is large. Let's have a quick discussion about other items and focus on the items where there are more misalignment. And that helps with shortening and also focusing in the discussion on things we're not aligned on. Remember, this is a bulk estimate, which means these are things further out in your backlog that don't require you to do a perfect solutioning right now. So keep in mind that this is meant to have quick discussion and a quick alignment across the teams. Once you do this round, so this is just silent sizing, then the team comes together and discusses one row at a time, ideally, or one feature at a time is another way to look at this. And so you will have the first item, you'll have the second item, and then the third item, and so on and so forth. So this is how that you want to facilitate this type of discussion in the team. Going back for a second to items that require clarification. So as people will have discussions, or if they're not able to really say whether something is on the smallest side of the scale or on the largest side of the scale, they'll throw it up and need clarification. Now, of course, every one of these items needs clarification, but we want to set up the environment in a team to say, I really don't understand what this means. And only then something can go into the need clarification bucket. This helps with not having all the items there, but it also helps with reminding the group that this is purely an explorative exercise. It's not an exact promise or prediction of any kind. Affinity maps can look like this in perhaps a non-software context. So you would start from the left with just generating a bunch of ideas that the group is coming up with. So this is a design exercise around content creation. Everyone just threw ideas. There's no good, there's no bad. It's just throwing up ideas all at once. It's a great way to generate a lot of ideas. So this is brainstorming. Then step number 2 would be to start to look at common things people said and cluster them or somehow identify them as higher affinity with each other. So affinity mapping. The third is to give them a label. So this is when we start to create larger themes around all the work. So we said everything here, well, what's the common term here on the blue side, for example? Well, that's delays. Okay, great. So that's how we're going to address items around anything to do with this topic is going to be labeled as delays, and it helps you organize your backlog as well. This is another example of affinity maps where a group of people threw up a bunch of ideas around the shopping experience or the or a supermarket experience, and they looked at things like, the value statement is I value convenience. So I'm also cost conscious. I like to eat healthy. So they've given very customer-centric titles to these to affinity groups, and that is also something that's very valuable. It helps you keep the voice of the customer in the front. Whether you're a non-software team or a software team, it keeps the customer's voice very heavily in front of you when you start to label them in quotations of what a customer would say. You can use this in things like journey mapping and just understanding your general set of users as well. A couple of tips. Now this is taken from somewhere, but and not all of them may apply to you exactly this way, but a few tips. Number 1, affinity mapping works best when you limit your participation, so you want to keep it to a smaller group. It doesn't have to be 5 or 6, your team may be bigger than that, but how do you keep it contained within this team? And you also don't want to spend too much time on investigation and things like that, so it's supposed to be a quick process. The process of ideation and grouping should be silent, and so don't talk about it. This is an important thing. People need silent time to think and be critical. And there are a couple of benefits of this. Number 1, they can actually think and be critical. The second is that if you have folks in your team that are introverts or generally on the quieter side, they're not comfortable speaking up, it allows them to provide input into this process as well. So it's a very inclusive process if you by keeping it silent. If you have fewer than 15 data points, affinity diagrams may not be necessary. What this really means is that if you have a small set of items to do, whether it's in a software or other context, if you have a small set of items to do, you don't need to do affinity mapping. In your backlog. All right. That's affinity mapping. Now let's talk about t-shirt sizing. T-shirt sizing is something you may have heard in a lot more about than affinity mapping, but I wanted to set the stage on where is it slightly more effective or beneficial as you proceed. So if you have a large number of items to estimate, that's why we're here, requests that have low detail and time sensitivity to inform prioritization. Affinity mapping generally there is not much of a time horizon, although you could take an affinity map and then superimpose some sort of t-shirt sizing as a scale. But t-shirt sizing really helps with the combination of things that you don't know much about, but they're also immediate and time sensitive. So you're not exploring, you're a little more focused on informing prioritization and relative size. And it can help you quickly identify where to start with larger work. So I'll talk about the scale in just a second, but it'll really help you know where to get started. Where's the small size we can get started with? Well, a couple of benefits. Sparks healthy discussion. That's the same for affinity mapping, but this one, it jumps into the discussion. There's a lot less silent sizing here. Team alignment and sync, which is a key benefit that is really good with both of these estimation techniques. it helps to reduce wasted time on low priority items. So very quickly, when you start to talk about items that, oh, this is not important, let's just throw it somewhere, or let's not even talk about it, let's go to the other high priority items. And it requires light facilitation. There are a lot more tools out there now that people can use, but even then, even if simply setting up a whiteboard or a physical session somewhere, it's very easy to throw up items to do t-shirt sizing. That in affinity mapping as well, but affinity mapping may require a little more structure and more ground rules to create before you start t-shirt sizing. A couple of cautions, and this is from people that are very experienced in the industry, like Mike Cohen and other coaches and mentors. T-shirt sizes are, because they're not quantitative, are not additive either, which means we can't say small plus medium equal a large or anything like that. So there's no way to add it up to then do some calculations if you need to. The second thing is, it can be confusing for some like larger sizes. For example, in my mind, an XL is maybe 25% larger than a large, but in other folks' minds, it may be double the size or triple the size, whatever. So sometimes that can be confusing to relate with each other. So there are two ways to address the non-quantitative nature of t-shirt sizes. And you may have other ways. These are just two ways I'm going to cover today and talk about. The first one is you relate sizes to some set of story points. And you could do this right from story to features. And or you relate sizes and sprints together. So you get a sense of how much work something might be and would you require more or less sprints. So let's talk about sizes and story points first. What you could do, choose to do as a team. I've just provided one example, but you can talk about what makes sense for you, your team. Is you could say anything that is less than 2 story points is extra small. Anything between 2 to 5 is small, medium 8 to 3 story points, large is somewhere between 20 to 60, and extra large is 100 or more points, or anything really that is really big will just go into the extra large bucket. There isn't much value in adding any more sizes. You may also notice I added extra small. It's good to have that slightly smaller size to give you a little bit of a scale to work with. And this is from experience purely, so feel free to experiment with this. Keeping in mind, I've again used the modified Fibonacci series. You can use another modified series or not modified series, up to you. Fibonacci works really well. So just one little tip. This method works really well when you have a bunch of stories and epics. So your backlog is a little more focused, where you don't have too much variance in sizes. So you may have something that is a small story or a large story or an epic or a feature that is larger encompassing, but you don't have anything bigger than that. And generally, you've done a healthier job of managing your product backlog to look like that iceberg. All right. So in the case of sizes and sprints, you could choose to similar to points, but this time you're putting in the context of sprints. So the one thing is, this is really good for when you have requests, a lot of requests coming in for estimation of varying sizes, something from large to medium to small and all kinds of sizes that may be coming to you. This method can work really well when you're doing high-level product or high-level items. So you could say extra small is something that we can do within a sprint, just a gut feel again. And small is something between 1 to 2 sprints, and so on and so forth, up to anything that'll take more than 12 sprints is extra large. And now in here, this assumes a 2-week sprint, but the same concept could apply, and you can adjust these based on what your sprint length is or iteration length is. What if there are features that come to you? And so these are stories and things that are slightly bigger than stories, as in stories that haven't been broken down generally. But what about features? And what about if you haven't actually, if you don't have time to break down the work within a feature to really understand it enough to estimate it at a high level and do bulk estimations? Well, there's a simple tip for that. Just total up the recently completed feature that you did as a team, or recently completed work. So how does that work? So this is the scenario. Hey team, please estimate how long this new feature will take to complete. We need a timeline on this. We've had a previous feature that we totaled up because of the number of user stories we've estimated in the past, and you don't have to re-estimate, just total them up. And then you don't have any stories yet, and you don't have enough time to break down the estimate. What do? Well, you do this. You've been running in sprints, and every sprint you have a certain set of points that you burn, that you accomplish. And so over time, either you take an average of 3 or 6, doesn't matter. You take an average set of points that you are burning per iteration or per sprint. So you have that number, which is, in this case, in this example, 16 points on average. Well, let's say then we size this new feature that came to the team to be about 4 times as bigger than that feature in the past. So that feature was 24 points. This is about 4 times as big, so we give it 100 points. So you don't have any user stories, but you're just doing a general sense of, okay, what's required? Let's have a quick discussion. Let's look at what we had done, what was required in that previous feature, and then say, you know what, this is 4 times as complex to do. And so now it's 100 points that we estimated this feature to be, and we know our burn rate per sprint, and that's 16 points. So you do a simple math, divide 100 by 16, and you get about 6.25 sprints, but let's say around 7 sprints. So that's the rounding up a little bit. And so we focus on doing the work instead of documenting the work for an extended period of time until we actually have to work on it. But now you can use this to do a couple of things. 7 sprints does not mean you'll be done by 7 sprints. There may be other constraints in your work. We have a lot of dependencies. We, as a company, we do 1 or 2 sprints of just user acceptance testing or something like that. Add that extra time to this. So if it's it's 7 sprints but 2 sprints because this is our process that for change approval, etc. that will take before we can actually put it in production. Great. So you now say it's going to be 9 or 10 sprints to accomplish this feature and to put it in the customer's hands. You're going in with openness and honesty and saying, this is a super high level estimate. We haven't broken down the work. We are purely estimating it compared to based on information we have relative to work we've done in the past. And we're looking at our velocity that we've seen an average of in the last few sprints. Our velocity could go up, it could go down for various reasons, but this is just an estimate today. 2 sprints or 3 sprints from now, when we start working on this, our estimate will adjust and it will change, and you'll get a more realistic timeline. But that's the openness we go in with, and we set expectations with our stakeholders or requesters, what have you. So that's bulk estimations. We've covered a couple of things. We've covered affinity mapping, t-shirt sizing, and then what if you're asked for an actual date? Knowing that you don't know enough, knowing that you are going to be transparent about what went into the calculation and what you know so far. Please like, subscribe, and comment for any thoughts or disagreements or ideas you have for not only about bulk estimations, but any other video in the future. Now check out these videos for more Agile related content.